Tomorrow evening from 5:30 to 8 p.m., we will be hosting a sneaker culture night in conjunction with our Future Now exhibition. We are very excited to be joined by Dr. Delisha Matthews, who will be joining us from North Carolina State University, where she serves as an associate professor in the Wilson College of Textiles. Dr. Matthews is a dynamic speaker, and she's a leading expert on sneakerhead history and culture. So we're really excited about her talk tomorrow night. She'll be speaking from 6 to 7, and throughout the evening, we'll also be providing free food, some really exciting raffle prizes, art activities, and music by DJ No Limit. So we encourage you to join us and to also spread the word to any sneaker lovers in your lives. You can learn more about this and many more other upcoming programs by visiting our website, and we also have flyers available on our side table. There you will also find surveys where you can fill out your feedback about today's ArtBreak, and we would so appreciate if you could take a moment to do that after the program today. If you'd like to support free programming like this at the KIA, please feel free to leave a donation in the collection box at the front desk or to contribute electronically when you register online. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Sam Grossman. Dr. Grossman is a longtime docent of the KIA, and we are so grateful for his meaningful contributions to our educational offerings here at the museum. From leading tours to offering ArtBreak lectures like this, to facilitating gallery gatherings, and much more. Very, very grateful for Sam's contributions to the museum. He is also a frequent instructor with the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, where he teaches a variety of topics. Dr. Grossman is a retired pediatrician, and prior to medical school, he was an associate professor of theater arts, so he has worn many hats. So today he joins us to speak about the life and legacy of 20th century artist Hughie Lee-Smith, whose remarkable painting, The Spectators, is part of the KIA's permanent collection and is on view in our lower level galleries. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Sam Grossman.
Thank you. If you have trouble hearing, I guess just shout and I'll try to talk a little louder. I'm holding my cell phone in my hand just to remind everybody, if you have a phone with you, I'd appreciate it if you'd silence it. We don't want to be listening to Baby Shark halfway through the program here. I thought it was kind of interesting that I'm going to be talking about this painting because it's really one of my favorite, the painting that Miriam mentioned, The Spectators, which is one of the paintings that we'll be talking about, but it's the only one of his that we have in our collection. Because when I first came to the KIA as learning as a docent several years ago, I knew nothing about Hughie Lee-Smith. I didn't know his name. I didn't know any of his paintings. But that painting of his, The Spectators, has been a favorite of mine, I think, in the collection for as long as I've seen it. It's just a very provocative painting. It drew me in from the first time I saw it. I've used that painting at a lot of tours that I've done here, and I always find something else to talk about with it, with the groups that come through. And I would say that the painting seems to interest people from elementary school up through adults. They always seem to find something interesting to talk about this painting. I really had just a superficial knowledge of this painter's life. And I thought, I think it's time that I do some research, find a little more about him, which I did. And I was really excited to find that he was an incredibly prolific painter and also that he had a really interesting life. So I thought, since I've done all this research, I might as well share it with other people, and that's what led to this talk this morning. So I just had a couple of quick sort of cautions, I guess I would call it. Most of the works that he did were oil paintings. So in that case, when I've shown the images, and I'll be showing you a lot of images, I'm not indicating what medium they're in, but the ones that are not oil painting, I've specified the medium. You'll see that as we go through. Second thing I want to say, and I'm sure you're aware of this, standing in a gallery in front of a painting is a very different experience than looking at these images of these paintings on screen. But just to clarify, all the images that I'm showing you either came from print medium or from online sources, and it's very hard to know how exactly close these are to the original works. And even the lightness or brightness of the images are hard to see if they are close. But this is the only thing we have to go by, so at least bear that in mind when you're looking at some of these. So onward. So Hughie Lee-Smith was born in a small town in Florida early in the 20th century, spent his whole life in the 20th century. So he was born in 1915. Story is that his parents were married when he was born, but split up not long after his birth, the assumption being that they married only to prevent him from being an illegitimate child. And I get the feeling he really didn't know much about his father or know his father very well. So for the early part of his infancy, he lived with his mother, Alice, and then the two of them moved in with Alice's mother, that is Hughie's maternal grandmother. And then not long after that, his mother left him and went up to Cleveland to study music. And so Hughie was left with the care of his grandmother. And this was been in Atlanta, and he lived with her for about 6 years. And I think, as you'll see, he played a major role in shaping his youth, but I think probably a major role in shaping his entire life. His grandmother was named after Queen Victoria, and she was affectionately known as Queenie. And she was one of those women who promoted a strong sense of discipline and pride. And apparently Hughie was very precocious, an infant. He was able to read and write very early, and his relatives always referred to him as the little man. And he says, my 6 years under her exclusive rearing was characterized by her insistent emphasis upon personal cleanliness, good manners, and good posture. My accessible playmates were limited to 2 children who lived down the street. Apparently they lived in an area where there were a lot of children, but Queenie did not. Queenie called most of those ragamuffins and said that they were not appropriate for him to play with. But he said, my time was occupied with fulfilling an insatiable curiosity about the world, and once at school pursuing learning with great gusto. Now, you remember, this is before TV. We're talking in the early 1900s. So Hughie was allowed to listen to the radio as a leisure time activity, but only Queenie's most favorite and only favorite radio station, which was the BBC. So he was allowed to listen to the BBC. And so over time, the announcers and actors and so on of the BBC became his radio friends, such that by the time he started school, he had developed a cultured British accent, which he kept for the rest of his life. And I've heard a couple of short clips of speeches by him, and it's interesting. I mean, he sounded like he could be the host of Masterpiece Theater. He just sounded very cultured through his whole life. But he was able to visit Cleveland, where his mother was living then, at least once a year during the summer. And finally, Alice, his mom, moved him and the grandmother, Queenie, up north when Hughie was about 10 years old. And I think she immediately recognized his artistic talent and got him enrolled in Saturday morning classes, art classes at the Cleveland Art Museum. And I got the feeling from things that I had read that these were classes really designed for adults. I think Alice was very persistent in getting him enrolled, and it was pretty obvious to the instructors that he had a good bit of talent. And he said, I drew all the time. It became a natural thing. I breathed it. I dreamt it. Art was my whole being, and I knew from an early age that was my mission. In junior high and high school, he sort of broadened his interest a little bit. He started running track. He was in high school. He ran hurdles. And one of his older teammates, in fact, was Jesse Owens, who, if you're not familiar with the name, was a sprinter who became the star of the Olympics in Germany in 1936. But midway through high school, he definitely decided that art was going to be his career. So he focused his studies on fine arts. He became president of the art club. But he also was interested in performing arts. He sang in the choir, the glee club. He performed at least in one Gilbert and Sullivan operetta. And here's a couple of art pieces from his high school career. Now, the year he graduated in 1933, he added a hyphen to his name. So he was born Hughie, middle name Lee, last name Smith. But a good friend of his said, someday you're going to become a famous artist, and Smith is just too undistinctive a name for you to have. So you should hyphenate your last name. And that's in fact what he did. So he became, for the rest of his life, Lee-Smith hyphenated. And the year after he graduated high school, he won an award through Scholastic. It was a competition. And he won it only because he hadn't even entered it. One of his high school art teachers submitted some of his works to Scholastic. And as a result of his winning it, first of all, he was the first Black students to win the scholarship. But it got him a year of study full-time at the Detroit Society of Arts and Crafts. And after that, he did so well that he won a scholarship to Cleveland School of Art, and that lasted him about 3 years. And here's a couple of pieces from his career right after high school. So now we're talking sort of the mid-30s, and about this time, he really continued to participate in theater and operetta. He joined a biracial, what he called an experimental dance group, and apparently they performed all around Ohio. He even had a solo, and he wrote at one point, "I think I could have had a very good career as a dancer if I'd continued." So you see, the guy was pretty multi-talented. But around this time, he entered what I would think of as the first sort of phase of his career, which I would guess I would call social consciousness. So there was an organization in Cleveland called the Caramoo House, and this is a settlement house or sort of a neighborhood organization, and it had been founded by a couple of Auburn college grads in the 19 teens. And this had become eventually a haven for African-American artists in the Cleveland area, all in performing arts as well as visual arts. And they, in fact, had received a number of grants from the Franklin FDR administration, that Works Progress Administration. And they hired Hughie to come teach printmaking. So he taught lithography and linocut. Both of these are forms of printmaking. And although he knew printmaking, he really became a pretty proficient printmaker. That's a lot of P's in one sentence. But as you'll see as we go on, that most of the rest of his works were really oil paintings. But his subjects drifted toward what we sort of would think of as social realism. And as he wrote, "As a member of the Depression generation, I was part of a movement of protest and revolt against the seeming failure of the economic system to deal effectively with the prevalence of hunger and unemployment." Sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? So here's some works from that period. Now, later, he went traveling to Detroit again, but this time it was for looking for work. And I think this was a preview of his future, and I would say probably the preview of a lot of artists, professional or amateur. They were always needing to find some sorts of income to support his painting. So he worked at the Ford factory for quite a while, and not only did that provide income, but it also sort of fueled his interest and his commitment to the workers and their families through the Ford plant. And while he was in Detroit, he met his future wife. This was his first wife, first of 3 wives, but he did meet her in the Detroit area. And soon after that, so this had been around 1940, he was hired by a small college in Orangeburg, South Carolina. He was hired to head their art department. But they stayed only 2 years. Now, he was married then, but he and his wife were very unhappy there. First of all, he was not getting paid very well. But second of all, remember, this is small town, South Carolina, 1940. So they experienced a significant amount of racism, and it drove them out of there. And so they relocated back to Detroit. And at that time, some of his prints were accepted into a group exhibit. Now, I'm going to talk about group exhibits off and on. What a group exhibit means is there are maybe 4, 5, or 6 artists included in the exhibit, which meant that probably each artist only had a few pieces in each exhibit. But his works were accepted into a group exhibit that was touring through the Midwest. And so he began entering a number of art contests with these juried competitions because they paid prize money. It also got his work seen, but it was a good source of supplemental income for a young married couple. Now, 1943 came and he got drafted into the Army, Navy, I'm sorry. And he was stationed just north of Chicago. There's a Great Lakes Naval Base. And he spent a 19-month tour there in the Navy as an artist. And during the Second World War, the US military, all the branches, had a number of artists in their ranks. And mostly they used them to sort of create art with historical or patriotic themes. He called these morale paintings. And of course, again, this was in the 1940s, so he was confined to an all-Black unit in the Chicago area. And here's some works from that period. Now, the good thing about being where he was he was near Chicago, which meant he could continue the opportunity to commune with other artists in the metropolitan area, as well as exhibit with some of those artists. Now we get to what I would consider, this is post-war period, the beginning of the second phase of his art, which is really his mature work. And this would become the mainstay of most of the work through the rest of his life. A lot of these had sort of signature and characteristic elements, and I'm going to talk about those in a little bit. But here's a couple that are early that will show you kind of a different direction here. This is called The Scientist. And I think it looks quite different in style from the ones he had before, or at least maybe the theme. Now, in 1953, he and his wife divorced, and he also then began enrollment in Wayne State University over in Detroit, and ultimately got a Bachelor of Science in Art Education. But through all this time, he continued to enter and win competitions, that is prize money, including a big prize from the Detroit Institute of Arts. And we'll talk about that in a moment. While he was a student, he got hired by a couple of very upscale Tony art organizations in the Detroit area. One of these was officially a school. It's called the War Memorial Association in Grosse Pointe. And there he taught regular classes. And also in Birmingham, another Tony suburb of Detroit, the Birmingham Art Association. There he gave private lessons. And this is a photo of one of the private lessons he was getting. Now you have to remember, we're talking about a well-dressed African-American male, 1950s, cultured British accent, and he's teaching in a very intimate setting the white relatives of Detroit corporate executives. But reportedly, he was an excellent teacher and referred to as a model American artist, a man known in Midwestern society for his culture and distinction. And I have no doubt some of that had to do with his British accent. Later in his writings, his wife happened to find this quote that in his writings, this was after he had died. Art school, the writings came from early in his life. Art school is not a place to learn a trade. That'd be a vulgarization of its purpose. It is rather a place where skills are learned for the sake of facilitating expression, not necessarily for making a living. And I'm sure most artists will agree with not necessarily making a living. So when we get into the late 40s and 50s and beyond, we start seeing in his works the emergence of sort of signature elements, and I'm going to talk about these individually, themes that he dealt with, settings that you see in a lot of his paintings, props that sort of appear in a lot of his paintings, and the use of certain figures and their poses. And these are going to persist through the rest of his career with some variations, but they're pretty consistent. So we'll start talking about figures first. He believed it was important for viewers to have images of figures to relate to, realistic, representational figures. And here's, again, another quote from his writings. Visual art is, in my view, a mode of communication. These surface shapes and colors can be orchestrated in such a manner as to convey a meaning to the observer, either on a conscious or subconscious level. My own position is that for these signals to be effective as agents of communication, they must be realistic. So typically his works have in them a small number of figures. So here's some examples. And this is the spectators, which is we have in our collection. In fact, I think looking at this painting, I think this is the largest number of figures in any painting of his that I've been able to see. So usually they're anywhere from 1 to 3 figures. Sometimes these figures are a little elongated, so they look a little odd, but they're still reasonably representational. You see again, the woman looks just a little taller than you would expect her to be. I'm going to come back and talk about this particular painting in a moment or two. The interesting question always is in these paintings of his is what, if any, is the relationship among the figures? And if you notice, here we have a painting with 3 figures, but they don't seem to be in the same world. I mean, they're not really relating to one another. And here's some other examples. As you notice, we have 3 figures very close to one another, but they could each be in their own world. The guy is juggling, and the 2 other figures are not apparently even paying attention to him. I always find this kind of an interesting title, The Rendezvous. They don't really seem to be rendezvousing, as I would expect the word, but again, small numbers of figures, not necessarily that we can see them interacting. And oftentimes we'll see in his paintings that the identity of the figures is either hidden or somehow shielded. Either their faces are in shadow or partly covered or their backs are turned. Sometimes he even has them doing different activities that cause them to turn their back to us. So you see somebody there shaking out a blanket. 2 women in the same space, but not necessarily relating to one another. Who are they? We don't really know. And again, here's a woman on the beach shaking out her beach towel, which conveniently covers her face. We don't know who she is. So what does this all add up to? It's sort of the thematic effect to me seems to be that you have figures who appear almost to be alone while they're in the presence of other people. So you have loneliness while they're not, quote unquote, alone. It's sort of isolation in the presence of others. And I think it leads to sort of a sense of perhaps these figures being alienated from one another, even though they're in the same close environment in many cases. Now, another thing that's common on his elements, I think, are certain settings that he uses over and over and over again, and sort of what I would call environmental influences. A lot of these are in urban areas, and a lot of these are sort of adjacent to waterways or shorelines. And as you'll notice, many of these have, no matter where they are, sort of little bits of crumbling architecture or structural elements. And again, I think you'll see when I can show you more images here. So the urban settings, very common environment for him, especially sort of decaying urban structures. And of course, this reminds me that he was in Detroit in the 1950s and later. So here's some examples. So it's an urban scene, Sunday afternoon, but yes, there's this debris in the foreground. And maybe some of those buildings look like they're a little bit boarded up. This one I showed you before. So the guy is playing handball against the wall, but you notice some of the masonry is peeling from the wall. There's some debris. Whoop, sorry, I skipped one. It's a landscape painting. We don't typically think of landscape paintings with elements of, it's a falling apart building. And then this that I showed before, a boy with tire. Again, boarded up buildings, a little bit of that fence in the foreground on the left. As you see, all of it is just a little bit seedy looking. Now, this particular painting that I just showed you, The Boy with Tire, is in the collection at the Detroit Institute of Arts. And interestingly enough, in 1953, a small group of patrons purchased this painting. This is his first major museum purchase. And they donated it to the DIA, along with a painting by another 20th century African-American artist, Jacob Lawrence. So if you notice again, we have a figure isolated, reasonably realistic looking, but his face is slightly shadowed, so we don't get a full view of him. It's not exactly clear what he's doing. Is he waiting for someone? Is he just taking a pause in whatever he's doing? And I think as I look at this, and I've noticed critics say the same thing, it almost looks like he's on a stage set by himself. Notice also in this painting, strong shadows. And you'll see these appear in a lot of his paintings. Some of it, I think, is typical artist having a source of light in some cases, but it also adds an element in these paintings, a visual element of these strong shadows. Why is he here? Is he waiting for someone? Is he observing someone else? Lots of questions, but as we'll see, not a lot of answers, which is maybe what art should be doing for us. I want to say something else about this painting. About 30 years later, apparently he visited an elementary school in Mount Pleasant, Michigan. And apparently they must have written to him some questions about the painting. And this is his response. There are boys and girls all over, and this is in 1983. There are boys and girls all over our country who do not have nice clothes to wear and live in tumble-down neighborhoods. Nevertheless, these unfortunate children find ways to have fun despite ugly surroundings. The young lad in my painting found rolling an old cast-off automobile tire could be great fun. So the tire became his toy, became his friend. Now, the reason I put this in, because I think it says a couple things about him. One, that the guy, he would have been in his 60s at the time, painter for quite a while, would take this much time to write this much to a school class that he had just visited. And the second thing is, to me, it harkens back to perhaps what might have been some of the loneliness of his own childhood and the inability to have friends to play with. And maybe those inanimate objects were his quote unquote friends. Now, in the urban area, we also see that he uses a lot of rooftops. So here's some examples. Again, you notice the masonry kind of falling apart, the debris in the painting on the right. So why rooftops? Well, you got to think about the fact that people who are on rooftops are really isolated in a way from all the stuff going on down below them. Um, but they're also out of the urban stress and out of the urban decay. And maybe it's either a place of getting away or it's a place of safety and refuge. It also gives people a chance to, quote unquote, look down on society. And I think it's another metaphor for isolation in a way. Now, another frequent setting that he uses is proximity to water, either figures on jetties and piers or people on beaches. Um, and if you'll notice, a lot of these piers or jetties have some, again, little crumbling architectural elements. And then this painting that I showed before, and we'll get back and talk about in a little bit. So again, these jetties sort of give an emphasis to a sense of being isolated. They're sort of stuck on a platform somewhere. In fact, one critic suggests, again, that these jetties function almost like a theatrical stage for the characters, the figures to be on. Now, the other place that figures are near water is on beaches or shorelines, but usually these beaches and shorelines are not, the Riviera. They're sort of rough and rocky and kind of littered. Sometimes there's dark, stormy clouds in the background. And it's somewhat ironic because other people have commented that Hughie really liked to go to the beach. He liked to stroll there. He liked to take photos. He liked to sketch his friends at the beach. But there's a different view of the beach here. Again, some fences that are kind of falling apart, some structure, we're not quite sure what that is. The sand is not nice and smooth here. Again, you notice the beach is a little bit rocky looking, and once again, the figures are not really relating to one another, and we don't really see who these figures are. And if you notice, these settings all seem to enhance, in a way, the sense of the isolation or alienation of these figures. One commentator has wrote, the way in which he was able to depict loneliness and despair and the existential feeling of being all alone are timeless. Another thing we see in his paintings very frequently are a series of, I guess, what have been referred to as props, balloons, ribbons, flags. And we see these a lot. So sometimes the figures are holding these, sometimes they're part of the decor, sometimes they're sort of up in the air, sometimes they're sort of sagging. But we'll talk a little bit about maybe where we think these came from, but here's some examples. So you see again in this painting, there's that little saggy balloon in the front. In the center, there's that little bit of ribbons hanging off a pole projecting from that wall, and flags in the background. This appears to be some kind of playground structure, but again, with ribbons hanging off it. And they're near water. More balloons. This was painted within a year of his death, by the way. So you may wonder, why do these continue to reappear? I mean, we all know, if you've seen lots of artists that, or lots of paintings, that many artists will use repeated images or little things perhaps from their past that seem things that appeal to them, things they like to explore, things they have seen that impress them. And it's been said that his house where he lived in Atlanta growing up was very close to a place where there was a fairground where tent shows, circuses, carnivals would come and visit. But he was not allowed to go there because grandma did not think it was appropriate. And so he says, I was utterly fascinated with the sights and sounds, the carousel music, the ribbons, the pennants, the balloons, and riotous colors. The experience must have sunk into my unconscious and manifested in myself years later in his paintings. And I think if you think about, again, a young boy growing up, kind of isolated from a lot of society, but not allowed to reach out to the things that look so colorful for him, that these were obviously important in his life, and therefore they keep reappearing in his paintings. Now, alongside of the major work that I've shown and we'll continue to look at, he also, throughout his whole life, continued to paint what I guess we would call sort of traditional art subjects, so nudes, still lifes, and just straight portraits. And he did these, we think, mostly to sharpen his skills, just like a pianist would sit down and play scales or etudes, not necessarily to perform them, but to keep the fingers limber. So he liked to keep his painting technique up to date. And he did this through his whole career. So here's some examples from various points in his career. And this is, again, much later, 1982. But he continued to do this through his career. So as his style began to change in the 50s or so, he really started at that point, starting to get some limited critical attention beyond just the Midwest. And so, for example, he was participating in a group show at Howard University. The critic from the Washington Post who reviewed this didn't seem too impressed with anybody else in that exhibit except for Hughie, and he called him an exciting discovery. Now you have to remember, he spent all of his formative years in education in the Midwest. And this was a time when the East Coast, especially New York City, was the center of the art world, even for the whole world, not just in the US. So in 1958, he relocated to New York City, lived in Greenwich Village, but he continued to teach in a variety of places, down into Washington, D.C., where Howard was, New Jersey and Princeton, and so on. Now, he continued to exhibit regularly while he was in New York, but usually these were small or group shows where he would just have a few pieces in the group show. And he exhibited through the Midwest as well as the East Coast. But again, these were mostly in private galleries or smaller museums. And he really never had a major solo exhibit until 1988. And he was over 70 at that time. Now, his daughter, from his first marriage, she was an only child. She had lived with her mother, and when her mother died, she was about 16, the daughter, that is. And so she moved in with Hughie. And I put these statements in mostly so you get an insider's perspective on him in a way, because she called him thoughtful and intellectually engaging. She noted he was a constant reader. He read a lot of things other than art, science, philosophy, mathematics, and he liked to photograph a lot. I think some of these were just of friends, but a lot of times these were figures and environments that he then used in his paintings. So in the late 60s, he was hired by Howard University. So this is the black college in, historically black college in Washington, D.C., as an artist in residence. And his statement about this was this: I inspired and supervised a group of my advanced painting students to create and permanently hang on campus buildings a group of really stunning murals on Black pride. And I'll come back and address this a little later toward the end of this talk, but I think this was sort of a rare connection of his to the movement, the Black arts movement that was going on in that period, because his personal focus had always been on the kind of works that I just showed you and will continue to show you. So in 1964, he remarried. That marriage, unfortunately, only lasted 3 years. And in 1967, he was elected to full membership in a group called the National Academy of Design. Now, I didn't know that much about this, so I did a little digging about this. So this is called the National Academy of Design. It was founded in the early 1800s in the US, and this goal was to promote art and architecture throughout the US with exhibitions, educations, and research. And today, if you look at their website, they bill themselves as the leading honorary society for visual arts and architects in the US. And here's their mission statement: we advocate for the arts as a tool of education, celebrate the role of art and architects in public life, and serve as a catalyst for cultural conversations that propel society forward. So Hughie had been teaching for them, sort of doing gig work, but he was elected to full membership in 1967. The point I want to make, though, is he was the first African-American elected to the society in 40 years. The only previous one to him was Henry Osawa Tanner in 1927. So in 78, he married for the third and final time. This was an art student of his, and this turned out to be a very loving and lasting marriage. And the two of them eventually, a couple of years later, relocated to New Jersey. Now, it's interesting, if you look at some of his later works, like from the 1980s and onward, women seems to be much more common subjects. And I'm tempted to think that this could have been because now he had a relationship with a woman that he was very fond of and had a successful marriage. So here's some examples of some of his later work. This painting I'm going to come back and talk about in a little while. This was painted the year of his death. So if you might notice that some of these later works, the settings seem to be a lot more unrealistic, that sort of what could be called disjointed realities, more like dream worlds maybe, or imaginary worlds. They also have more colorful patterned backgrounds, and frequently they're sort of bizarre kind of architectural elements and statuary. So here's some more examples. Think about these back to the ones I showed you earlier, people standing on a jetty or people standing on a beach. Again, the balloons are still there. Still see the figures that are not relating to one another so much or at all. But again, the background's kind of different. Again, the ribbons, a little bit of the masonry kind of falling apart. So I think it's true that over most of his entire career, he was really less recognized and appreciated by larger institutions or major art critics. So most of the paintings that were purchased were either by private individuals or less often by big-time American museums. And it's interesting that during the time of his first major retrospective, one of the art critics wrote that he had not been included in a single important exhibition in New Jersey where he'd been living since the 1970s. But interesting enough, here's from something in his writings from 1978. I'm sincerely trying to get at something invisible and almost impossible to express. I'm not so much concerned with whether people like or understand it. I never have been. I've never painted for the crowd. But even through his career, he still occasionally painted what we would think of, I think, as much more realistic portraits. And this is years later. So this is in 1979 of his third wife, Patricia. And this is in 1994, a portrait of David Dinkins. Now, David Dinkins was the first African-American mayor of New York City. And when he retired, Hughie was apparently hired to do his official portrait. And this, I think, hangs in the New York State building. So I thought I'd spend a little time talking about what could be artistic influences on Hughie. First thing is, a lot of his works have been compared to those of the American painter Edward Hopper. Most of you are probably familiar with this painting of Edward Hopper. Nighthawks. So it's no doubt that Hughie would have been aware of Hopper. Hopper's work shares some of the sort of same thematic qualities as Lee-Smith: loneliness, isolation, alienation. So here's some examples of Hopper's that I think sort of show you where perhaps people might have come up with this idea. Two people in the same environment, but not really relating to one another. And a figure that you have to look to see where the figure is, and of course the figure's back is to us. It's a really interesting painting, I find. That dark thing on the left, obviously a movie theater where there are crowds, and then spotlighted is this woman, isolated for some reason. We don't know why she's there. We don't know what's bothering her. But again, look, that wall is separating, literally separating her from the crowd. And then this kind of unusual landscape. But I think you can agree, at least I feel, that while their themes may be the same, stylistically, his paintings are quite different from Hughie's. And so I don't see any evidence of direct influence. But one that I think is a much more direct influence is an Italian painter by the name of Giorgio de Chirico. And de Chirico, his most important work was around the World War I, which is about the time Hughie was born. And de Chirico at that time was known for what he called metaphysical art. And this came from his own readings in philosophy and his interest in classical architecture. So de Chirico's what he called metaphysical art, the way he described this and others described it, you sort of combine disparate elements, things that don't seem to belong to another. You oftentimes use these architectural elements or statuary, and frequently his works have these strong shadows in them. So the environments look familiar, but these shadows give you a sense of kind of vague danger. And most of his works have these very unusual titles. So here's an example: Melancholy and Mystery of a Street. Now you notice again, the real strong shadows here. There's that figure in the lower left corner with the hoop, and some people have tried to compare that to that painting that I showed you earlier, Boy with Tire, which also has a figure with a round object in the lower left corner. But then you see up in the middle there, there's that shadow with might look like it has a spear or lance. What's going on? What's going to happen after this? And then that unusual title. So here's a few more of de Chirico's works, so you just get the idea. A little strange. Again, very shadowy, unusual locales. And we know definitely that Hughie had an interest in de Chirico. In the 50s, I think it was, or early 60s, he spent quite a bit of time studying de Chirico's work. And we also know that Hughie was an avid reader of philosophy and other literature, which is where de Chirico got his influence from. And I can't help but point out what I think is, I would call it a non-artistic influence, and that is his having grown up in the Great Lakes. As he said, years later, I've come to realize the unconscious influence of Midwestern climate as a key factor in the development of my color scheme. My predilection to cold and dark skies and sparse flat landscapes in my painting undoubtedly due in measure to the long, continuously gray winters of my youth in Ohio and Michigan. And of course, we can all sympathize with that. So now I want to show you some selected works that I pulled out that I just want to talk about briefly. And again, we could probably spend a whole hour talking about any one of these paintings. First of all, the Spectators, which I've shown you before. So this is in our collection. It's hanging downstairs. And so you see we have these 4 figures, all male, facing us, the viewers. The title of this is The Spectators. What are they looking at? You notice they're standing on that jetty. They're obviously near a lake or ocean of some kind. I always think of Lake Michigan when I see this, especially from the Chicago side. The dark sky, the dark water. The figures are there together, but they don't seem to be relating together. We're not sure why they're there. So in a sense, they're in the same place, but they're together, they're isolated from one another, isolated from the environment around them. And then he has all this great space around them, the clouds in the air, the dark sky, that sort of gives you a stronger impression of they're being isolated. And although I've always been drawn to this painting, it always leaves me with questions, which I think is what good art should do. And then this painting, which I called 3 Women, I almost find the reverse of Spectators. Instead of 4 males looking out at us, we see 3 women looking away from us. They're looking at what we think is the water. They're on some kind of jetty or structure that seems to be a little crumbling. And the sky just looks so dangerous to me. All those dark clouds, what's going on over there? Is there a fire? Is there a storm? And if they're scared or there's something happening, they don't seem to be comforting one another as women might if they were frightened, being where they are. And of course, their identifications are hidden. I keep wondering, should they really stay there? Is it safe for them to stay there? Then we have Maypole. So we have an environment that looks kind of industrial, maybe, or commercial, a sort of shady, maybe rocky ground, commercial buildings in the background. And then we have a woman, quote unquote, dancing around the maypole. This seemed kind of oxymoronic. They don't necessarily be in the same space. I'm also interested when I look at this as the tension in that woman's arms and body, how great it captures that leaning that she has. And then this painting, Outing. So when I hear the word outing, I think of this nice, friendly, relaxed, convivial atmosphere of people out in nature together. But no, we see 3 figures confined on a very small space. The figures are not relating to one another. The 2 women are doing very active things. And you see that tension in the woman in the back maybe throwing a stone or something in the water. The woman in the front with that same tension that we just saw in the maypole painting. And contrasted with that, the very stable figure of this male who doesn't seem to be looking at them at all. His identity is partially hidden by the shades. he's wearing, and he's looking at us? Who's he looking at? Why is he looking at it? Why isn't he looking at them? Why aren't they looking at him? What are they doing there? I don't have answers to those. And maybe none of us have answers, but maybe we have our own answers. Then this other painting that I showed earlier, Rendezvous, as I mentioned, these people don't seem to be rendezvousing to me together. A rendezvous to me suggests a more intimate environment between two people. And these people their identities are hidden. We don't really see them relating to one another. She's messing with her hair. She's not looking at him. He's carrying what looks like maybe a picnic blanket or something like that. They're off-center, just as we saw in the spectators. They're moved way over to our right. And that structure behind them, which could be maybe a diving platform of some kind, would have served by a nice frame if they had been in that frame, but they're not. They're off frame. And again, this dark clouds, stormy clouds maybe, dark water. The witness. So in this case, we obviously have a figure that's centered. Her face is away from us. But when you look at that hand, I mean, she seems to me like she's tense. She's obviously concerned. We don't know what she's witnessing. We can use our imaginations, but the clouds are building up behind her. She appears to be probably on a rooftop that's, again, a little crumbling. What's going on? But just watching her, I just sort of feel a tension in this painting that draws me in and keeps asking me the questions that I'd like to answer. How much danger does she see? How much danger is she in? And then this last painting that I wanted to show you, man in a green sweater. So we've got this strong horizontal structure going across, but again, little pieces of it have fallen off. We see those streamers in the air, those balloons or those ribbons that are blowing in the wind. And then we have this very static figure of a man. We can't see his face. Is he depressed? I kind of feel like when I turn my back on this painting, I'm going to hear a splash when he jumped into the water. Could be suicide? Is he just contemplative? But instead, he's called Young Man in a Green Sweater. So I think each of these works, at least it seems to interest me, they're realistic figures that we can relate to. They're also very provocative, as I keep pointing out to you. They leave us with a lot of questions, and they compel us to fill in the answers. And a lot of these, I think he's exploring his own personal views of the human condition, challenging us to explore with him. But these are filled with all these sort of personal images and references. Now, one of the last things I want to talk a little bit about is race. Hughie was an African-American male whose life spanned the entire 20th century. So you think of all the things he would have experienced: racism, living in the South, segregated military, civil rights struggles, Black Power movement, Black arts movement. Obviously, race had to play a role in his life. And in 1978, he said, "In my case, aloneness, I think, has stemmed from the fact that I'm Black. The condition of the artist is already one of aloneness. In all Blacks, there's an awareness of their isolation from the mainstream of society." And then he adds, "I felt it more in my youth." And I mentioned to you about in 1953, he won this prize from the DIA. And he said at that time, "I was no longer called a Black artist, Negro artist, colored boy. When I won that prize, all of a sudden, there was no longer a racial designation." I thought that was a step forward. I think he was also aware that there were very limited role models. He said, "Having been born in the early part of the century, I was witness to a period which was almost devoid of Black art heroes." Now, I think despite all this, from my perspective, I don't consider him to be a Black artist, because I think his works don't generally center on purely racial themes. And that's unlike a lot of the Black contemporary artists of his, later in the 20th century. I think his works are much more universal, and therefore, in the mid to late 20th century, they probably weren't trendy enough. So here's a statement. This is from one of his galleries that carried his works, and this statement comes from after his demise. At a time when white artists were thought of as simply artists, African-American artists were expected to paint, sculpt, or draw the Black experience. Now, David Driscoll, he wrote a foreword to one of the two monographs about Hughie Lee-Smith. David Driscoll is an African-American artist and professor. And he wrote, the Black art of the 1960s was often conflated with protest art. That is, to be Black art, it had to contain an element of protest. And Driscoll went on to say, he never felt that his art emanated from his Blackness. African-American contemporaries debated whether, as a Black artist, he was Black enough. In raising metaphysical questions that could concern all human beings, he was seemingly abandoning his battle station. And Driscoll sort of implies that those 2 years he spent as an artist in residence at Howard University ended because his contemporaries thought he wasn't unfashionable, or he was unfashionable. And again, this is coming from an African-American artist and professor. He said, or he states, Hughie's colleagues at Howard were accusing him of being out of touch with the Black arts movement. And a critic later wrote, now this is in 1995, this critic from the New York Times, who saw an exhibition of solo of Hughie, said, Mr. Lee-Smith paints more in sorrow than in anger. And while this may not serve him well in the political arena, it produces art that improves with age. And I mention that because I think in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, I think Hughie Lee-Smith has become more recognized and more appreciated. He had a touring perspective toward the end of his life. He has two major monographs. These are big hardback books with lots of images in them. And in 2020, one of his early paintings sold for $365K. So I would think that 365,000 is probably a good measure of increasing popularity if you look at it in those terms. So in 1992, he was diagnosed with prostate cancer, but he never stopped painting. And 2 years before the end of his life, he relocated with his wife to Albuquerque, and that's where they spent the last 2 years of his life. And he died in 1999. And here's a photo of him from close to the end of his life. I want to go back and look at this painting one more time, which I find really interesting. So this is painted the year of his death. It's called Facing Tomorrow. So we have a figure who's looking off to the side. So I'm immediately thinking, wait a minute, if she's facing tomorrow, why isn't she looking toward tomorrow? Is she looking back over her shoulder? Is she looking toward tomorrow by remembering the past? Now, she's got the ever-present balloon, and behind her is a wall with little cracks in it, and there's graffiti with balloons in it. There's also two arrows, one facing left, one facing right. Maybe the past and the present. Then we've got a little railroad train that appears to be traveling maybe at that little cartoon that's looking like it's trying to stop the train, perhaps. So this is Facing Tomorrow that he left us with. So if I've whetted your interest, I'd like to make some suggestions. Number one, we have this super painting called The Spectators hanging in our gallery downstairs. If you're not familiar with it or haven't spent a time with it, wander down there, spend 5 minutes, not 10 seconds, looking at that painting. Take some time with it. The second thing is, I mentioned there are two big monographs, that is hardback books with lots of images in them, available. Our library has both of these books. And if you come in while our library is open, our amazing librarian, Jacqueline, would be happy to pull one of these out for you. Pull up a chair, sit down at a table, spend 30 minutes, and look through these slowly, not as quickly as I've had to look at these, and take a peek at these. If you're ever in the Detroit Institute of Arts, or you happen to go there for some other reason, exhibit, check out, they do own I think, about 3 or 4 of his paintings up in their collection of African-American art. It's great to see these in the flesh, so to speak, rather than on the screen. And the last thing is, I would suggest, if anybody got a little loose change in your pocket and want to purchase a Lee-Smith painting and donate to KI, I have a feeling we'd be happy to accept it here. So I want to thank you for your interest and appreciate your being here. And if anybody has any questions or comments, I'd be happy to take those now. So thanks again. I don't know, any thoughts, questions, comments? Oh, other than the lights just came on? Yes, sir.